They were just children, twins holding hands stepping off the train. Less than an hour later, they were standing naked under harsh lights in a place not even nightmares dare visit. Dr. Josef Mengele's lab. The train doors screeched open into winter air. The platform was alive with shouts in German, barking dogs, floodlights slicing the dark. Around them, a sea of striped uniforms, pale faces, confusion. These weren't battlefields or hospitals. This was Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the twins had just arrived at the gates of a machine designed not to house them, but to study, dissect, and discard them. Their names were often simple: Miriam and Eva, Jonah and Miriam, Edith and Judith. They were 5, maybe 6 years old. Or 9. Or 12. Too young to even spell experimentation, let alone know they were now test subjects in a human laboratory dressed as a death camp. As families poured out onto the snow-crusted platform, one thing became instantly clear: twins were special. Not in the way parents meant, but in the way that caught the eye of the SS officer calmly watching the selection ramp. Clipboard in hand, boots gleaming, a slight smile curling at his lips. His name was Dr. Josef Mengele. And he wasn't looking for workers. He was hunting mirrors, 2 matching bodies, 2 sets of genes, a perfect human experiment ready-made by nature. Mothers whispered prayers. Fathers dared not speak. But Mengele moved like a conductor through a quiet orchestra of chaos. He would spot twins instantly, almost instinctively. "You two twins?" he'd ask, sometimes in German, sometimes through translators. And if the answer was yes, everything changed. The family would be split immediately. The twins were gently pulled aside, often reassured, given a smile. "You'll be safe," he'd lie. "Your parents will join you soon." But the truth was carved in silence. The parents were sent left or right, work or death, and the twins were tagged for study. Their names were replaced with numbers, often tattooed onto delicate forearms. From that moment forward, they were no longer children. They were Mengele's twins. A term whispered in blocks and bunks. Both privilege and death sentence. They were escorted to a different barracks, cleaner than the others. Sometimes they received extra food, warm clothing, blankets. Some even had beds. It seemed to outsiders like a gift. But that comfort was camouflage. Behind the doors of Block 10, the experiments began. Mengele didn't just want to observe, he wanted to alter, compare, push, rip apart nature's blueprint and see what happened when you played God with flesh and blood. These children, who had barely begun to understand the world, would become objects in a monstrous game of science. The horror hadn't even started yet. But already the atmosphere around them was wrong. Too quiet. Too precise. The guards who led them didn't shout. They escorted them kindly. And that's what made it worse. Even kindness here was a trick. Eva Kor, one of the most well-known survivors, would later recall that her first hours in Auschwitz felt like a confusing spell. There was no screaming. No torture. Yet. But there was something unnatural in the air, like the ground itself was holding its breath. In the camp built to kill millions, these twins were not executed on arrival. They were reserved. Like specimens. Like tools. And Dr. Mengele, ever the gentleman in uniform, made sure his test subjects arrived alive and smiling, before turning them into silent pages in his personal notebook of nightmares. If this first glimpse into Mengele's lab disturbed you, imagine what's coming. If you're human, you'll want to know how far it went. Subscribe to the History Scar, because some histories should scar us. Before the clipboard, before the boots, before the selection ramp, Josef Mengele was just a boy from Günzburg. Born in 1911 into a wealthy Bavarian family, Mengele was raised with every advantage. His father owned a successful machinery factory, the kind that kept German industry humming between wars. He wore fine clothes, spoke with careful politeness, and impressed teachers with his intelligence. His future was not shaped in a gutter or on a battlefield, but in lecture halls, medical schools, and drawing rooms of the educated elite. He earned a PhD in physical anthropology in 1935, studying under the famed and deeply racist Professor Theodor Maleson. 2 years later, he added a medical degree to his name, the perfect credentials for the future he would carve in horror. But his most fateful decision came not in a classroom but in a uniform. Josef Mengele joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1938. To him, Nazism wasn't madness, it was order. An ideology that turned his scientific ambitions into state policy. He saw the world not in terms of morality but in measurements, skull sizes, bloodlines, purity. In Nazi Germany, this wasn't fringe theory. It was government doctrine. Eugenics, the selective breeding of humans, had taken root in Nazi thought. The regime believed in a master race, and saw other groups from Jews to Roma to the disabled as genetic threats. They weren't just unwanted. They were seen as biological contaminants. And Mengele? He didn't flinch. He embraced it. Coldly. Eagerly. He began his work at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene. There, he honed the twisted idea that genetics could be weaponized, that science could be molded to serve ideology. He impressed his mentors, wrote academic papers soaked in racial pseudoscience, and soon caught the eye of powerful men. In 1943 he was transferred to Auschwitz, not as a grunt, but as an elite physician with near-total freedom. Here, finally, he saw a chance to test his theories in the most grotesque of laboratories, a death camp with an endless supply of human subjects. But he wasn't looking for chaos. Mengele wanted control. And nothing offered more control in biological research than twins. Twins, to him, were nature's perfect experiment, genetically identical, raised together, arriving at the same place at the same time. They allowed him to test one child while keeping the other unchanged, as a comparison. In the language of science they were a dream. In the language of ethics, a nightmare. He called them my twins. His pet projects. His portfolio of flesh. And he wasn't working alone. Back in Berlin, researchers received his reports with interest. Data was shipped back to academic institutions. His work, however horrifying, was part of a broader Nazi project to remake humanity itself. The Reich gave him everything he needed: space, freedom, victims. Even when reports surfaced of his cruelty, no one stopped him. In fact, he was praised for his enthusiasm. Supported by the highest levels of SS leadership, Mengele turned Auschwitz into his playground of pathology. He moved freely between gas chambers and surgical tables, between mass murder and meticulous note-taking, between genocide and curiosity. To the prisoners he was terrifying, but to his peers he was promising, a rising star in the Nazi medical machine. He was no wild-eyed sadist. That would be easier to understand. Josef Mengele was something colder, a man who dressed cruelty in lab coats, who gave torture a thesis title, who looked at the murder of children, and saw data. That is the monster science helped make. The barracks where Mengele's twins were kept had a different silence than the rest of Auschwitz. It wasn't the silence of death, but the silence before a scream. Inside, the children tried to sleep. Some clutched their siblings. Others stared at the ceiling, wondering if tomorrow would be the day they were summoned. And when it came without warning. A guard would call their number. No explanations. Just a nod toward the clinic, a place with clean floors, white sheets, surgical tables. It didn't look like a chamber of horrors. That was part of the illusion. The suffering here was precise, measured, recorded. Dr. Mengele didn't believe in random cruelty. He believed in controlled cruelty, in the manipulation of bodies to serve a twisted theory of science. Every child who entered his lab was there for a reason. And every procedure was logged in ink, even when it ended in death. Twins would often be subjected to blood transfusions, one receiving the blood of the other in carefully tracked volumes. Mengele wanted to test whether the body could be forced into transformation, if biology could be overwritten by will. The children grew weak. Fevers rose. Organs began to fail. There were no antibiotics. No painkillers. Just notes, temperatures, pulses, and silence. Other times he targeted reproduction. Girls as young as 10 were sterilized without warning. Their wombs damaged beyond repair. Injections of caustic chemicals. Radiation burns to the pelvis. He believed he was preventing undesirable genetics from passing on. But in truth he was destroying their future, ripping out motherhood before it could ever take root. Then came the eyes. Mengele had an obsession with heterochromia, twins with different colored irises. He believed eye color was a marker of race. So he tried to change it. Children were strapped down while doctors injected chemicals directly into their eyes. Blue dye, bleach, formaldehyde. The results were predictable: burning, blindness, infection. Some children's eyes clouded over completely. Others bled for days. And still Mengele took notes. He wrote an elegant German script, describing each change, each failure. But what he never documented was the pain, the tears, the permanent damage. Because in his eyes, the agony wasn't part of the data. He conducted amputations too. Not because they were needed, but because he could. A twin might have a leg removed to see how the other coped. Or an organ extracted, liver, kidney, even parts of the brain. These procedures were often done with little or no anesthesia. Children bit through cloth to avoid screaming. Some simply passed out. Others woke up mid-operation. Those who survived were often crippled for life. Those who didn't were noted as incomplete subjects. And when one twin died, the second was killed immediately, not out of punishment but for comparison. Mengele would lay both bodies side by side on autopsy tables. He would cut them open and examine every detail, lungs, hearts, spines, searching for some phantom clue in the symmetry. The most well-known survivors of these experiments were Eva and Miriam Moses Kor. They arrived in Auschwitz at just 10 years old. Blonde-haired, Romanian Jewish girls, the kind Mengele found useful. Within hours they were separated from their parents forever and labeled as useful twins. Eva would later recall being injected with unknown substances. Her body ballooned with fever. She was left to die in the infirmary. Miriam stayed by her side, forbidden to cry, forbidden to leave. When Eva didn't die, Mengele was surprised. Not pleased, curious. He wanted to know why the experiment failed. He took more samples. He ordered more blood. They survived barely. But the trauma lived in their veins long after the needles left. Eva eventually went on to speak publicly about what happened, founding a Holocaust remembrance group, but the nightmares never left her. There were hundreds more. Names lost. Children broken. Test subjects in a laboratory where empathy was forbidden and pain was the currency of discovery. Mengele didn't raise his voice. He didn't beat his victims. He used instruments, notebooks, and scalpels. His evil wasn't loud. It was clinical. That's what made it so chilling. Dr. Josef Mengele didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He didn't drag children by the arm. He smiled. He often arrived at the children's barracks in polished boots and clean gloves, tipping his cap as if stepping into a schoolhouse. In his pocket, chocolates, lollipops, sometimes even toys. He handed them out gently, calling the children by name, kneeling to pat their heads. He made them laugh. He was, for a brief moment, a kind face in a world built to erase kindness. And then he picked his next subject. This was Mengele's greatest deception, not just what he did but how he did it. To the prisoners he seemed almost too composed, too clean. He was never hurried, never anxious. His charm was the blade, disarming, polished but sharpened to cut deep. In the twisted theater of Auschwitz he didn't just play a doctor. He played God. He decided who lived, who died, and who would be broken in the name of science. No committee. No oversight. Mengele could walk the selection ramp and move a finger left or right, and that was the difference between gas and life. Between experiments and ash. To many that kind of power should have looked monstrous. But Mengele wore it like silk. He moved with elegance. He quoted Goethe. He whistled Beethoven as he strolled through the corridors of death. One survivor, Jonah Locks, recalled how unsettling it was to hear him whistle during procedures, calmly, tunefully as he ordered injections, amputations, or postmortems. He didn't speak like a butcher. He spoke like a professor. But underneath the cultured mask was a mind that delighted in control. Mengele didn't only want data, he wanted domination. He played games with his subjects, especially the twins. He would suddenly test their knowledge, quiz them, demand they perform for visitors. Sometimes he brought outsiders, German doctors, SS officers, even wives, to observe the children like specimens in a showcase. He trained them to thank him after each injection. Eva Kor once described how he would visit their bunkhouse and select a group of children seemingly at random. He'd laugh, compliment their hair, tell them they were special. Then the next day half of them wouldn't return. And no one dared ask where they went. His presence alone was enough to drain the room of sound. Children froze when they heard his voice. Adults lowered their eyes, even those who outranked him on paper. He held a kind of gravitational pull, not out of admiration but fear. He wasn't a man of rage or violence. He was something colder, calculated cruelty wrapped in charisma. To the guards he was efficient. To the SS he was reliable. To the children he was an angel of death with perfect posture. And that paradox made him unforgettable. Because evil in a uniform is one thing. Evil with a smile, evil that offers you candy while holding a syringe behind its back, is something else entirely. And for the children of Auschwitz, that smile would haunt their dreams long after the war had ended. Survival in Auschwitz was not a triumph. It was a sentence, a lifetime of memory, of silence shattered by nightmares, of trying to rebuild a soul dismantled in childhood. And yet some spoke. Eva Moses Kor was one of them. She and her twin sister Miriam arrived at Auschwitz at 10 years old, clutching each other's hands as the rest of their family disappeared into the smoke. Mengele marked them as specimens. From that moment on, their lives were no longer their own. Eva would later recall being injected with substances so toxic she ballooned with fever. Her limbs throbbed, her skin burned, and her organs began to fail. A camp doctor stood over her bed, told her she had 2 weeks to live. But she didn't die. And in Auschwitz, survival wasn't just life, it was proof. She crawled back from the brink. Because she knew one thing: if she died, Miriam would follow. Mengele always needed comparisons. One dead twin meant the other had no value, except on an autopsy table. That knowledge bound them. It bound all of them. Twins in the camp developed a code of quiet rebellion. They learned to whisper warnings, to share crumbs of bread, to fake smiles when guards approached. Some smeared dirt on their wounds to hide infections. Others bit their lips until they bled just to stay awake, afraid sleep might be mistaken for death. Jonah Locks, another twin, described how her sister and she created their own rituals. They would memorize each other's faces, checking for changes. Was one losing more weight? Was one bruised? They protected each other the only way they could, by not letting go. Even older inmates, though not twins themselves, sometimes stepped in. They smuggled food, gave up their blankets, distracted guards when experiments were called. In a place where humanity was designed to fail, these children carved out moments of resistance, not with weapons but with love. But survival came with a cost. Dr. Miklos Niesli, a Jewish physician forced to assist Mengele, saw everything from the other side of the table. He performed autopsies on twins murdered hours after their siblings died. He stitched the outlines of horror into clinical reports. And though he survived, he carried the guilt of a man who was both witness and unwilling accomplice. After liberation, the physical wounds faded, but the psychological ones festered. Eva suffered from chronic pain and recurring nightmares. Miriam's kidneys had been damaged beyond repair by Mengele's injections. She lived in and out of hospitals until her death in 1993. Jonah Locks struggled for years with a silence that consumed her. Even after the war, no one wanted to listen. People wanted heroes, not traumatized children haunted by syringes and scalpels. For survivors, the world outside the barbed wire didn't always offer comfort. Some were called liars. Others were told to move on. So many fell into depression. Some never spoke of the experiments again. They lived, yes, but they carried the burden of memory like a second skin. And yet, a few found their voices. Eva Kor founded an organization dedicated to Holocaust education and forgiveness. She stood in classrooms, museums, and courts, telling her story again and again, not for herself but for the twins who couldn't. She said, "I was a victim, but I refused to live as one." Still, that burden remains. The knowledge that their survival meant watching others die. That their stories are proof of something that should have never happened. It is a cruel irony. To survive is to remember, and to remember is to relive. If these survivors had the courage to speak, you can have the decency to listen. Subscribe now. If you're still not subscribing, tell us in the comments why this isn't worth remembering. When the gates of Auschwitz were torn open in January 1945, the camp lay in silence. The ovens had cooled, the needles discarded, the lab scrubbed clean of evidence. Josef Mengele had vanished. In the aftermath of the war, as survivors were carried out on stretchers and the world grappled with the weight of what it had allowed, Mengele walked away. Not as a prisoner. Not even as a fugitive, yet. He simply slipped into the chaos, one of thousands of Nazis trying to disappear into the smoke of a broken Reich. While Nuremberg gathered the architects of the Holocaust for judgment, Mengele stayed hidden in Germany, using false names and sympathetic contacts. For nearly 4 years, he lived in plain sight under the alias Fritz Hallmann, even working as a farmhand in Bavaria. Despite being one of the most wanted war criminals in history, no one came knocking. The world was busy rebuilding. In 1949, as Cold War tensions began to replace wartime justice, Mengele made his move. With the help of secret Nazi escape networks known as Ratlands, channels forged by former SS officers, Catholic clergy, and fascist sympathizers, he traveled through Austria into Italy, where he secured falsified papers from a Red Cross refugee office. The destination written on his documents was Argentina. He boarded a ship and arrived in Buenos Aires, where former Nazis were not just hiding, they were thriving. Argentina under President Juan Perón welcomed thousands of them. War criminals blended into expatriate communities, protected by wealth, silence, and distance. There Mengele resumed his life. Not in shadows but in comfort. He worked as a carpenter, then as a salesman. He went to dinner parties. He invested in a pharmaceutical company. Sometimes he even used his real name. Throughout the 1950s and early 60s, the Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, began hunting Nazi fugitives. They famously captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires in 1960. But Mengele slipped away again, alerted by whispers before agents could reach him. From Argentina, he fled to Paraguay where he obtained citizenship. Then to Brazil, where he lived under the protection of wealthy Nazi sympathizers and exiles. He moved between safe houses like a phantom, always one step ahead of justice. There were sightings, rumors, Interpol warrants. Germany, Israel, and the United States all issued alerts. Yet no arrest ever came. In 1979, while swimming off the Brazilian coast near Sao Paulo, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke and drowned. He was 67 years old. There were no guards, no trial, no last words for the children he had crippled, mutilated, and murdered. For years his death went unconfirmed. The world hoped he was still alive, hiding in terror. But in 1985 his grave was found, under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. Forensic analysis confirmed the identity. The angel of death had died peacefully, in warm waters, under a false name, surrounded by those who had protected him. The survivors received no justice, no day in court, no confrontation, only a tombstone in a foreign land, and a silence far too easy. When the war ended, justice was promised. Trials were held. Crimes were catalogued. The world swore it would never forget. But some stories were too horrifying, too strange, too scientific to fit neatly into the narrative of war crimes. The experiments on twins, Mengele's personal obsession, were not immediately spoken of. In the earliest post-war years, survivors were encouraged to move on, to rebuild, to forget. The idea that children had been used as lab specimens in a death camp felt unbelievable, even among those who had seen the worst. And in many courtrooms, so-called medical crimes were treated with less urgency than mass executions or gas chambers. There was no official trial for Josef Mengele. No systematic prosecution of the researchers who collaborated with him. The complexity of the experiments, wrapped in academic language and fake data, made them hard to define. They weren't just murders. They were violations of science, of childhood, of the very concept of care. For many survivors, the silence was a second wound. Eva Kor, after years of suffering in silence, finally spoke. She testified, she lectured, she founded the organization Candles, Children of Auschwitz Nazi Deadly Lab Experiments Survivors, to help locate other twins and preserve their stories. But even Eva's voice became a source of controversy. In 1995 she did something no one expected. She publicly forgave Josef Mengele. Not because he deserved it, not because she forgot, but because, in her words, I refuse to be a victim any longer. For her, forgiveness was a way to reclaim power, to free herself from a life ruled by hatred. Some called her brave. Others called her a traitor to memory. Survivors argued in public. Historians debated her words. Could someone who tortured children be forgiven? Should he be? Eva never asked others to follow her. She only insisted that her survival gave her the right to define her own healing. The medical data Mengele left behind sparked another moral debate. Should it be used? Some researchers believed that even though the experiments were barbaric, the findings might save lives. Others argued that using the data, no matter its scientific value, gave it a legitimacy it never deserved. In the end, most ethical bodies rejected it. The cost was too high. The methods too corrupt. No discovery, they said, should come from the cries of dying children. But the struggle to remember didn't end there. For decades, Mengele's twins were left out of Holocaust exhibits, textbooks, and films. Their stories didn't fit the broader narrative of industrialized genocide. They were seen as fringe cases, medical anomalies. It wasn't until survivors began speaking out in the 1980s and 90s that their experiences gained public weight. Museums began adding exhibits. Books were written. School curricula changed. Still, the psychological burden remained. For every survivor who spoke, dozens stayed silent. Some could not bear the memories. Others feared being called liars. The idea of a doctor smiling as he injected poison into children was simply too much for many to accept. But forgetting is never neutral. In Auschwitz today, the memory of Mengele's lab is preserved, not just in glass cases and photographs, but in the stories that echo through the halls. Rusted instruments, twin-sized shoes, medical notes in precise German handwriting. Each artifact asks a question. How could healing be used to harm? How could science serve death? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because memory is not just about the past. It is a warning. At the heart of Josef Mengele's lab, the greatest horror wasn't only what was done, it was why it was allowed. He didn't operate in shadows. His experiments were funded, reported, reviewed. The Nazi regime handed him a scalpel and called it progress. He wasn't dismissed as mad. He was praised as efficient. This is what makes Mengele's legacy so dangerous. It wasn't just about one man. It was about a system, cold, calculated, and dressed in the language of science. He proved how easily cruelty could disguise itself as care. How a stethoscope could hang from the neck of a killer. How a laboratory could be more terrifying than a firing squad. And how genocide doesn't always arrive with screams. Sometimes it begins with paperwork, clipboards, and clean white coats. The twin experiments at Auschwitz were not accidents. They were deliberate, systematic, endorsed. And the children who endured them were not collateral damage. They were targets. But they were also something more. They were witnesses. Eva Kor would often say, "We were experiments, but we were human." That sentence cuts through time like a knife. Because for decades the twins were spoken of in numbers, in case files, in pathology reports. But when you hear their voices, when you see their faces surviving, testifying, smiling despite everything, you realize they are more than history. They are evidence. They are the proof that even in places designed to strip away identity, dignity can endure. Many of them never fully healed. Some never spoke of their time in the lab. Others used their pain to educate, to warn, to fight against denial and indifference. And that might be the most powerful truth of all. Because survival was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of ours. We now live in the shadow of what they endured. The ethics they forced us to examine. The boundaries of science they made us redraw. The moral questions they left behind like ashes from the crematorium. How far is too far? What are we willing to excuse in the name of discovery? And who do we decide is less human? Mengele gave the world a terrifying blueprint. But the twins gave us a line in the sand. That line says, never again. Not just, never again to the camps or the gas chambers or the swastika. But never again to the quiet normalization of hate. Never again to power without conscience. Never again to silence when children are hurt in the name of research, profit, or ideology. Some of the twins lived long enough to hear themselves called heroes. Others died without that recognition. But all of them, every child who lay on Mengele's table, every twin who whispered comfort through a bunkhouse wall, deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as witnesses to what it means to survive the darkest parts of ourselves. And it is our responsibility to make sure the world listens. Because memory fades. History gets rewritten. But truth remains if we are willing to carry it forward. That's why we told this story. And that's why you're still here, because deep down you know this isn't just history. It's a warning. It's a mirror. And it's a question we must all answer. What kind of people do we become when no one is watching? This isn't just a video. It's a record. And if you're watching this far, you know this story matters. Subscribe to the History Scar, not for entertainment but because this pain must be remembered. Like this video if it moved you. Share it if you believe others need to hear it. Comment below, not just to engage but to speak for those who never could.